everybody. This is Valerie Bono from Proactive, and you're listening to the Building Bite podcast. Today's episode spotlights Paul Holley, a professor within the McWhorter School of Building Science and director of the Center for Construction Innovation and Collaboration at Auburn University. Tune in to dive into the world of construction technology and research with our topic, Higher Education, Solving Industry Imperatives. For more information on this episode and others, check out The Building Bite at buildwithproactive.com.
Welcome to the Building Bite podcast, a podcast for construction contractors, owners, and insurance professionals, where you can hear from the experts about key topics that may interest you and help you to be successful. I'm Chris Epps. I'm a senior director with Proactive, and I'm joined here with my co-host Mike Diercksen, our senior consultant of innovation and content solutions. Our guest today is a thought leader in construction technology space and a professor with the McWhorter School of Building Science at Auburn University, Paul Holley. Paul, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on.
Absolutely. We're excited to have you and kickstart this discussion. Mike, how about yourself? How are you this morning?
Doing great, Chris. Got a few friends who go to UF and might be a little upset with me for talking to another SEC school, but excited to have Paul on and have our conversation.
All right. Well, today we're diving into the world of construction technology and research, and our topic is higher ed, solving industry imperatives. And it's great to have you on the show today, Paul, because you're so immersed in that. But before we dive into our main topic, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to Auburn.
Sure. I came to Auburn as an undergrad in the early 1980s, and somehow or another found myself as a dual major in architecture and building science. And then along the way figured out I'd be a terrible architect. And but it was good. It was a good experience to help me with, to empathize with designers, I think. But it allowed me to do an internship with an architecture firm along the way, but then I also worked summers in bridge construction on concrete crews. So after I finished my undergrad in the 1980s, I went to work for Robins and Morton, and primarily in field positions. I was a superintendent with those guys, and primarily worked on projects that were acute care facilities or other types of inpatient hospitals, that sort of thing. Which was a real treat for me because the systems, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and other systems inside of hospitals is pretty challenging, and so I really appreciated that. I somewhere along the way in there, I went back to pursue an MBA. I thought that would be useful for my professional career, and then I went to work for BL Harbert, and I was a division manager for those guys, and helped them open offices in the Florida Panhandle and in Atlanta. And then somehow came back to Auburn in 2002 to join the faculty in the School of Building Science. I got roped into finishing a PhD along the way, and here I am.
That's excellent, Paul. It sounds like Auburn was a calling in some ways, right? You went there in the beginning, you found your way back. Was there always a drive to teach and to get into academia, or did you kind of fall back into that?
Yeah, no, I got tricked into it, I think. I didn't go back to grad school initially to prepare for academia. I just was interested in my own self-improvement and business acumen to help me and the companies that I worked for. And so I sort of stumbled into it after a former professor of mine reached out to me. And I just thought that was the craziest thing that I had ever heard, and thought, well, I hadn't been to campus in a while. I'll go check it out and get a free lunch out of it. And next thing you know, this May is 20 years, and I'm still here. So I guess that worked out.
What's that saying, Paul? There's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Yeah, exactly.
20 years go by.
Exactly.
Well, we're excited to have you on. We're glad to be able to speak with you on this. And I want to circle back. We had some great conversations in the past building up to this recording, and we mentioned industry imperatives. And I was hoping you might be able to share with the audience what exactly that means to you and at Auburn when you define an industry imperative.
Sure. Maybe the best way to do that is to sort of briefly tell you the history of the Research Center, which I am associated. We did our first project in the Research Center about 15 years ago. And it was a program with industrial design here at Auburn. And it was really interesting. We had students and faculty from both schools connect with industry And I learned a lot about what designers call problem seeking, which is real kind of as builders, we're taught to not create problems or to not have mistakes, but designers often will just, they'll acknowledge that those things exist, and instead of ignoring them or crossing their fingers and hoping that they don't encounter them, they'll actually go out to find them to see if we can find solutions. And some of the things that we produced in that program were ambitious, I would say, but some were actually pretty cool. And we actually have developed prototypes and have utility patents on about 4 or 5 things that came out of that program. And all of that was, all those things pretty much were centered on either productivity or safety, in some cases both. We worked with a lot of contractor and subcontractor industry partners who helped us as end users to test things. And then we worked with some manufacturers like DeWalt or Werner, Leica Geosystems, Conair, just to name a few. And, I really liked the iterative process that the designers use. They might come up with 20 or 30 concepts and narrow it down to 5 and then hybridize those and ultimately come up with what's the best solution. And I guess, again, as builders, we're sort of programmed that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and that everything has to be under budget, on time, and 0 lost time accidents. And so it was good for me to kind of retool the way that I might think about approaching solving problems in an academic research setting. So then about 3 years ago, sort of pre-COVID, we went through a strategic planning process with the Innovation Center. And while we had done a lot of good things for quite a few years, the collective thought was that we have a lot of latitude for faculty members inside of the school to be able to research things, but by the same token, it doesn't really help us have a more recognizable identity. So went through a strategic planning effort, and it included all sorts of stakeholders. And where we landed was, I thought, a place that is pretty clever, and that is, let's have a narrow focus, but that is defined by industry and changes over time. So instead of being sort of stuck to be the center of sustainability or concrete prefabrication or whatever, our focus is on, as you mentioned, industry imperatives. And so the idea there is that industry helps us come up with research topics that are some of the most pressing issues in construction at the time. And so that gives us identity by working on things that are very relevant and very current, but at the same time are broad enough so that many of our faculty members, based on their research interest, have an opportunity to participate.
It's certainly an interesting concept, Paul, the kind of the fluid nature of identifying those imperatives. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the imperatives you're currently working on, and maybe a little bit about the root of that, how you identify those industry imperatives to begin with?
Sure. Well, for this most recent 2 requests for proposals for research projects, the 2 imperatives that our industry representatives sort of challenged us with are, 1, the effective use or improving the use of technology on the job site, and the other is skilled labor shortage. And so, for example, on the technology piece, we were deliberate to say on the job site because there was at least some consensus that says we got software, we got tools, we got robots, we got drones, and all those things sound pretty cool. But at the end of the day, we need real data and real output that are actually going to help us do things better. And so that's one of the current imperatives. And we've got several faculty who are doing a variety of projects on that front. So we've got one group that's working with mixed reality to actually be able to check embeds in structural concrete frames for curtain wall and precast systems. We've got another group that are using tripod-based and robot-mounted LiDAR scanners to help collect data and develop point clouds, and then also to use the imaging data that those scanners also collect to help analyze job sites for potential safety hazards. So that's been a popular, quote, imperative for several of our faculty members to work on. The skilled labor shortage is a little bit of a harder nut to crack. And one thing that is interesting, it seems like a narrow research topic for academia, but the truth is there's a lot of ways to go about that. So, for example, one obvious research effort could be something related to how do we train more people. But how about instead, could we also increase the use of artificial intelligence or technology to reduce the demand for skilled labor, right? So we're not trying to replace full-time employees necessarily, but certainly in places where we've got such a shortage for skilled labor on construction sites, that would be a way to help that situation. Similarly, you could improve prefabrication techniques to require less on-site labor and to be able to do more things in a controlled environment. At Auburn, in our construction management program, we actually have 2 attorneys who practiced in construction law and teach classes on that front. And they have expressed interest in looking at immigration policy, which is very relevant to skilled labor shortage. So there's really a lot of ways to go about approaching these imperatives, and not just sort of what might seem the obvious solution.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think a lot of those imperatives are interesting to our audience. We've got insurance carriers and general contractors, and you touched on technology, skilled labor shortage, which are always kind of hot button topics trying to move the ball forward there. You also briefly mentioned safety. That's got to be a huge component, I would imagine, of what you guys are looking at. Is there something you yourself currently working on in that arena?
Yeah, we've got a few faculty that are working on that front. As I mentioned, we've got some faculty who are using job site technology to be able to do site assessment for potential safety hazards. When we did the program with industrial design a few years back, there were several solutions that were safety related. Some of them were about equipment warning systems, for example, or new hardware for temporary handrails around the building perimeter on multi-story buildings, and even devices that could be hard hat mounted to help determine, people that might be overheating. We also did a really cool project with Werner. Most people know Werner from their ladders. They're one of the biggest manufacturers of ladders in the United States, but they also deal in safety harnesses and some other things. And we worked on a project with them where we designed what we call the Dead Man, which maybe in hindsight was not the best name, but the idea, when we say a dead man, is something that doesn't move. And there's a lot of people that work on sloped roof surfaces, and you have trouble finding something reasonable to tie off to, or it's not proximal. And so we developed a portable device, weighs about 30 pounds, that workers can use on a sloped roof condition. And if they slip or fall, the mechanism triggers a powder actuated firing block, and it sort of instantaneously shoots fasteners into the roof deck. So it becomes a static dead man instantaneously. So that was a real cool safety related project to work on. And then we also have folks working on things that are a little more tangential. You mentioned, my own research. As a director of the Innovation Center, I have to be a little bit arm's length in how funding works because, we don't want there to be a conflict of interest. So my own work is related to the center and its innovative efforts, but I have to seek funding sources from elsewhere. And what I'm working on right now is a project that deals with the treatment and discharge of contaminated water that's produced by cleaning out concrete pumps and mixer chutes on the construction site. And what's really cool about that project is it was 100% brought to us by industry. We had an industry partner, a guy that owns a concrete pumping company, and he'd run into some situations where he was getting fined because of this concrete washout water that was being discharged, even though that's where the general contractor instructed them to wash out. And so that turned into a pretty cool project where we first worked with industrial design to look at how we could redevelop or reimagine containers. But then we quickly kind of migrated after figuring out that the solids weren't really the problem. It was the water that was the issue. And so we moved into more of a bench science approach, working with some colleagues across campus to figure out, could we use bioflocculants to treat and neutralize water so you can dump it on site. So that project wasn't funded through the center, But it is, I think it's a great example of the many ways that we partner with industry folks on projects that have they're not abstract, they have a very real application.
That certainly seems like a differentiator there. And I know many schools have similar programs to that of Auburn or have innovation programs, I should say. What's unique about Auburn and their approach that makes the program so dynamic?
Well, I guess I'd offer a couple of things. And I'm not sure this is, I know for sure that, we're not particularly unique in this way, but there's a lot of construction management programs that are housed with engineering or maybe even a business unit. There are some schools that are housed with architecture, industrial design, that sort of thing. And that's really been a strong point for us. No offense to our civil engineering colleagues, but the housing of building science with architecture and then also tangential design disciplines like industrial design is really made for some good collaboration, right? Because they are sort of natural partners, right? There's I kid with students that it's an arranged marriage between architects and builders, because if that's the business, if you're going into one of those businesses, there's a 100% chance that you're going to work with the other. The second piece, as you mentioned, there are a lot of CM programs, construction management programs, that have great industry connections and supporters. I would, with some bias, I would put ours up against anybody's. And I don't mean that sanctimoniously, but our program has been around since the early 1940s. And just by sheer longevity, we've got so many Auburn graduates that are in everything from entry-level positions to executive positions to ownership positions all over the Southeast. And that has really made a difference because we get so much support in a variety of resources. We think about time and money and funding and that kind of thing. But I'll tell you what, having industry to help you problem seek is a really sort of, powerful process. And I think the last thing, I think we've been doing this long enough where we've got a simple but pretty effective strategy. So the designers taught me a new word several years ago, ethnography, which basically means look around and see what doesn't work. And it's pretty amazing if you walk through a construction site and sort of recalibrate your mind for a moment. And instead of looking at things from a progress point of view, look at them from a problem point of view. And it's really kind of shocking where you look at, why in the world do we do it that way? Right? It's like, well, because we've been doing it that way for, 100 years.
Right. You kind of go through with blinders on, waiting for somebody to bring you a problem as opposed to looking around for things to troubleshoot.
That's right. So, so that's been a solid part of our strategy. And then also, like we mentioned, finding partners that would be interested in interdisciplinary research, bringing somebody from an outside lane. And they may not know a lot about the technical nuances of construction, but they may bring what I call a pleasant naivety or a necessary naivety to the table, because as you mentioned, it helps take those blinders off. And between that and the design collaborators teaching us the value of the iterative process, that's just really made for some good research efforts funded by the center.
Yeah, Paul, I really like what you said about that with the pleasant naivety, right? I mean, everyone learns differently. We all know that like you mentioned earlier, you go into a project and you say, well, the straightest distance between point A and B is a straight line. And sometimes just attacking it in a different way or looking at the problem in a different way brings up really intricate solutions, which might actually be better long-term solutions. So With that being said, if you have this pleasant naivety giving you those unique solutions, what do you think are some collaborations that might have worked for you? What's an example of when that's really played into it and helped you guys long-term?
Well, there's a few, and I'll share a couple. There's one project we did with industrial design, and our industry collaborator was a mechanical contractor. And the problem that they brought to the table was in some situations where electricity wasn't available, they were having a hard time in cold weather conditions heating up PVC pipe to get the solvent-based adhesives or glues to work. And basically, the technology available was kind of a fancy hair dryer, right? It was a hair dryer made by Milwaukee or DeWalt or somebody. And so immediately the construction students and faculty, mea culpa, we started thinking about quickly, okay, well, we need a better hairdryer, right? We need a better air-driven heat source. But the design students, they started thinking about all kinds of stuff. And what we ended up with was a chemical-based warmer, sort of like the pocket hand warmers, where you crunch them up a little, and mix the materials together, and it makes an exothermic heat generation. And that stuff's pretty cheap. And so we made it in a Velcro pouch. So in cold weather conditions, you could heat up the pipe and the fittings like something crazy, like 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. And you didn't need any electricity or batteries or anything. And that product is not flying off the shelf or anything, I'm not sure but that wasn't really the point. What I gathered out of that was one of the early projects that we did. What I gathered primarily was people that aren't burdened with knowing so much can really bring some creative solutions to the table. And so that was not only an important lesson to learn, but to really realize the value of smart people that can help be a part of your team that may or may not be experts in your field, but they have something to contribute for sure.
Well, it's certainly a refreshing and new approach, I think, to tackling some of our industry problems in an industry that's sort of slow to change, even in adopting technology. I guess given that, that sounds wonderful. But if there's three key takeaways you wanted to leave our listeners with, Paul, what do you think those would be, just top level?
Well, some of this is no surprise, but I would say that for the construction industry and academia, for that matter, change is happening at an increasing rate. And, it's a real roller coaster. And it's easy to get passed by if you're not going to be innovative. I can remember one of the things that we saw after the recession. Around 2010, 2011, contractors really had a different point of view on how they looked at innovation and trying to figure out ways to have competitive advantage. Because you couldn't just, with something that could impact the economy so quickly like that recession did, you got to be able to react and figure out ways to keep a competitive advantage. Second point, I with some bias, but I think working with academic partners just really has some great benefits. And so some of your listeners, whether they be contractors or underwriters or whatever, maybe that's something new for them, and I think that the benefits of working with an academic partner on research or some type of investigation is, one, you get some student perspective, which really, sometimes it's a little bit goofy, but I'm going to tell you what, man, these guys are so stinking smart. It's really a real benefit to get students and faculty members and other students from disciplines across campus with which to collaborate. So, for example, the project I mentioned earlier with this concrete washout water, I'm doing work with master's and PhD students and faculty members from the College of Forestry. And who would ever have thought that, right? But those guys are looking at nanoparticulate particles that they get from basically trees and figuring out what can we do with those things as from a surface chemistry point of view, right? And so next thing you know, I'm dragging these forestry students out onto construction sites and they're learning about pump trucks. So I do think that there's a lot of benefits in working with academic partners. And then I guess the third thing, just to be a little bit counter to that, is though, if you want to work with an academic partner, you gotta be patient, because we run on a different calendar. We got lots to offer, and we can provide some great innovative solutions and so forth, but just because of the academic calendar, and if we're doing work with undergraduates, well, they may, by the time they're able to make a real contribution, they may be graduated 9 months later. So, if your listeners are interested in that sort of thing, I think there's certainly great benefits, but manage your expectations on the time and sequence.
Yeah, great points, Paul. And it seems like more of a long-term partnership, right? You got to go into that with a long-term approach with working with higher education. And speaking of those partnerships and thinking critically and that mindset, we also like to give our audience an action item. So if there was one thing, if I'm the GC, the underwriter, the owner, if I'm listening to this today, what is something I could start doing today or tomorrow to maybe start moving in that direction?
I think that maybe the problem seeking is a real simple and easy and no cost kind of proposition. Is, challenge people in your organization to not ignore problems or, be resistant to pointing out things that could be better, but sort of embrace that. What could you do on a job site, or what could you do in an OAC meeting, or what could if you're watching a concrete pour, or you're seeing, you're looking at company data, maybe you're an insurance underwriter and you're looking at data that says, hey, there's a pattern here in these fall protection cases. And so instead of just going to the contractor and saying, well, y'all better be more safe, what can we do? I mean, if fall protection is an issue, well, then maybe we need to look at handrails and safety harnesses, right? So I think that would be a great starting point or action item, as you mentioned, to kind of start thinking this way.
And building on that, Paul, and I think each of the things you mentioned kind of have an element of technology driving those solutions forward. Personally, where do you see the industry struggling the most with technology and innovation and implementing those solutions?
Well, first, let me qualify. You're right. Sometimes they are technology driven. Other times they're not particularly, they're pretty simple. And I'll give you an example. We developed a stainless steel grip for concrete screeds, which, screed concrete with either a 2x4 or either an aluminum screed, but it's in the exact same profile, and it is terribly ergonomic, or it's terrible from an ergonomic point of view on your hand and your wrist. And so we developed this little steel grip that you pop onto it, and we let university facilities use it for some of their sidewalk and concrete paving work. And it took us a month to get it back from them. They wouldn't, So sometimes the solutions are pretty simple. But to your question of what we struggle with, or see the industry struggling with, first of all, and Mike mentioned this a minute ago, but I think our industry is resistant to change. And slowly but surely, I think we're kind of checking our pride at the door, but we could certainly do better and understand that. The second thing is there's so many good potential solutions that are out there, but I think you have to be careful and have a balance of how you do R&D, so to speak, versus meeting your business goals or your profit goals. Because all of a sudden, if you are operating in the same budget and you pump a bunch of money into process and software and policy, and now we need 2 extra programmers and 3 more drone pilots and whatever, and it doesn't leave anybody left to operate the nail gun or screw the studs together, or pull the wire. And I think that's something that our industry has fought really for the last 30 years, quite frankly. And sometimes I think our projects are underbuilt but overmanaged. And so I think that some balance there is probably worth thinking about. And then the last thing is, I think that some of the technological solutions, we mentioned drones and robots and, robotic dog. We've got one of the Boston Dynamic dogs that we use to,
all the cool stuff.
All that stuff shiny and sexy. And it's great. But, we all know about the difference between the leading edge and the bleeding edge. But you have to kind of figure out, well, what's got future, and then what's just the next thing or the next toy. And that's a hard spot to be in, because construction is real anxious to perform better, invest better, be more profitable. But some of this stuff you got to be really careful with one way or the other, because you certainly don't want to pump a bunch of money into something that's not going to have a meaningful ROI, but you also don't want to be you don't want to be the last guy in the musical chairs with no seat to sit in either.
And I guess given that and kind of supporting that end goal, is there anything you think higher ed and even technology and R&D firms could do better when it comes to integrating with industry to kind of as a means to that end?
Yeah, well, that's pretty simple for academia, at least, is don't let protocol and bureaucracy and policy, get in the way of doing big things. I mean, 20 years in, I'm still a little bit of a renegade on that front, I guess, trying to understand why we do things a certain way in academia. And, I get it. I mean, we're trying to, it's an institution, and we've got things like tenure and promotion and figuring all that kind of stuff out. So I certainly understand all of that. But by the same token, maybe I'm sure the dean wouldn't appreciate this, but maybe we could get more permission or more forgiveness instead of permission on that front.
Well, Paul, as we're beginning to wrap this up here, and it's been great connecting with you. You mentioned a couple times that coming up on year 20, where do you think that you are still professionally growing in this space?
Well, I think the number one thing is connecting with students, because they, as a generation and as a cohort, they have a personality, right? And their norms and what is meaningful or normal to them is different, right? College students today, they don't know a time. They do not know. They have no knowledge of a time with no internet or with no mobile phone. And so every year I get another year older, but the student body doesn't. So that means the gap between us is growing. And so I try to work real hard at trying to understand them better. And so can I change the way that I approach things or deliver things or experiences that I offer, to make better connections. The other thing is, and this is academia and also the construction industry as well. The long-standing academic model is you call it the sage on the stage, right? And that, you got to sit there and listen to whoever blab about something, and that's the end all. There's no, it's a kind of a one-way proposition. And even in the construction industry, we think about the guilds or the apprenticeship programs or that kind of thing. And that was just sort of the way we've been doing it for a few thousand years, is the older, more experienced people teach the younger, less experienced people. But the truth is, today, and certainly on the front of technology, the old dogs have some new tricks to learn. And so I try to be open about that and candid about that and encourage the students to help teach me. I've also used the term mutual mentoring. So yes, I can offer mentoring to students or for classwork or research or even as they're figuring out how to get into an entry-level career position. But I've got some stuff that there's some things that they can help me with too. And so I think being open to this mutual mentoring is a great way to maintain connections with the young people.
That's great. Yeah, I really, really appreciate hearing that. It's something I think that we need to focus on more, and we're hearing more about that from our guests, that there's these programs they're creating and trying to foster those relationships, and it sounds like you guys are doing the same down at Auburn. So wrapping this up then, Paul, we always do ask for a little bit of a curveball here. What is something that our audience may be surprised to hear about you?
Yeah, that's I don't know. My picture might be up in the post office or something. Let's see. Well, I tell you, I was thinking earlier when you mentioned your UF friends, and so I presume that means there might be some college football fans listening. But this is very painful to admit. My wife is a graduate of the University of Alabama, and my daughter is currently a senior there and is about to be graduated. And I guess that's my cross to bear, but I'll tell you, Novembers are painful in Auburn right now. Play those guys at the end of the season. But yeah, I'm outnumbered for sure.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a tough thing, and they've had quite a run. So you never know, though. Sports are cyclical, right? That's eventually right. It all comes around. That's right.
I pray every day for, Mike Shula or I don't know, Mike Dubose or somebody to come back and coach Alabama.
Well, Paul, we really appreciate your time today. And, this is the Building Bite. The Bite is BIM insurance technology with the experts, but we're asking, what are you taking a bite out of today? Is there a local delicacy, maybe something on campus, something closer to home? Where would lunch be for you today?
Well, as a matter of fact, in keeping with our discussion today, I've got some industry guys from a big general contractor out of Atlanta that are in town to talk about some ways that they might like to engage with research with us. And we're meeting at the Amsterdam Cafe, which is right down the street from our building in Auburn. It's a good local place.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, hope you guys enjoy your lunch, Paul, and I'm sure there'll be some great conversation there. So Thank you for chatting with us today. If our listeners want to hook up with you and also maybe reach out and contact you for that free lunch, where can they find you?
There's a few places. The easiest thing is probably go through the university website to the School of Building Science, and the URL is, auburn.edu, pretty straightforward, and they can look me up there. If they're interested in seeing some things that have come out of the center's research, that website is auburnccIC.org, and so they can go there as well. But probably the easiest is just simply go through the Auburn website to the School of Building Science, and they can find information not only on the school and the programs, but also the contact information for me or any other faculty member here for that matter.
Awesome. Well, it was great catching up with you today, and look forward to hearing what you guys are doing, producing big things in the future. Thanks again, Paul.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Building Bite. This podcast has been brought to you by Proactive. Check us out on thebuildingbite.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media for all future The Building Bite news and updates. You can also find us on your favorite apps, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Amazon. If you have ideas for episode topics that we should cover on the show, or you know somebody who would be a perfect guest, let us know at connect@thebuildingbite.com.